I use a lot of camera traps in my research, but they're not really built for high quality pictures. For that, you need a DSLR camera trap. Now there are some off-the-shelf remote triggers, and there are also lots of DIY camera trap designs, but once you start building those, the cost racks up pretty quickly. However, one has flown under the radar for nearly 30 years. This is the Nikon ML3. It's an old school infrared remote trigger release that requires line of sight to trigger it. And while its list price is $200, you can pick them up second hand for about 50 these days. Now that still seems overpriced for a remote release, but it does have a trick up its sleeve. You can set it to trigger when the infrared beam between the transmitter and the receiver is broken. So assuming you have a Nikon DSLR with the 10-pin socket, you already have a working camera trap there. If not, well, you can get one of these D300s for a little over $100 these days. It'll be pretty beaten up, but it'll work for you. Now, the real advantage for this kind of camera trap is that it's an active trigger, meaning it's a break the beam trigger, and that means you can be quite precise about where the animal triggers the camera. It gives you a better chance of getting that animal in good focus. But to achieve that, unless you have a log crossing or similar where you can predict exactly where the animal's going to pass, you need to spend another 10 or 20 bucks to get the extension cable for this, to get this receiver further away from the camera. You might want to put the receiver end into a tube because bright sunshine has enough infrared light to trick it into thinking that it's the beam. So when the sun goes in or a shadow passes over, it thinks the beam's being broken. It's a good way to weatherproof it anyway. It's useful to add a battery pack to the transmitter, which is easy to do just directly to the battery contacts here. But because the camera powers the receiver end, it's usually the camera battery that ends up running out first. And I find that with the battery grip, the D700 lasts about as long as the flashes do. But with the right connector, you can also add 6 volts of battery to the receiver end as well. This really is it for any diurnal species. But you'll probably want to add a couple of flashes for nocturnal animals. And there are a number of wired and wireless methods to do that. This is the cheapest. This is a really old school PC flash cable. But with these, you have to make sure the flash never goes into standby because it has no way of waking the flash up. So the first shot will actually wake the flash up. The second shot, the flash will fire. So you'll get a black image first, and then an image where the flash are fired, and probably the animal's reacting or running by then. One way to get around that is to stop the flashes going to standby and connect them to a car battery or something. But I prefer to use just AA batteries and let the flashes go to sleep. And that means you need to wake them up. Now there are ways of doing that with wires, but it's a bit fiddly. And these days you can just get a wireless flash trigger. You have to make sure you get one that does actually wake up the flash. The Pixel rooks do that, and so do the Camtraption's flash triggers. Unfortunately, they'll probably cost you more than the trigger. Okay, so now you're good to go. Well, you are if it doesn't rain, and this is Scotland. So in keeping with this budget-conscious system, I've made a housing here with stuff I had lying around the house. And yes, even the lens port in there is from a cheap underwater housing that fell apart. I'll put a link to that in the description. So it looks like crap, and I really need to put it on a tripod mount. But that aside, it's as good as anything else out there. Because it's an active break the beam system, it doesn't get triggered by the sun and shadows, and the beam is quite broad, so insects don't trigger it either. And it does have that degree of precision that the passive sensors don't have. Beyond that, it's all about finding your spot and getting the lighting right. Well, sometimes that's the way it goes. I got all the species I was after and a bonus squirrel, but they're all going in the wrong direction. And that's pretty typical of camera trapping. This was only out for a couple of nights. Whichever camera trap you use, it usually takes weeks of effort to get the right shot. So having more units is definitely a big advantage. And that's why several cheap ones might do better than one expensive one, for example.